All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a completely objective, but absolutely fascinating look at how the concept of sin is actually understood across vastly different modern Christian contexts. We're going to map out where these moral boundaries are drawn, who actually gets to draw them, and what happens when they get crossed. So think about it. Is sin defined by ancient texts, modern institutions, or, well, just your own personal conscience? We're going to explore this whole dynamic by looking at everything from modern sociological data that captures the lived realities of everyday believers, all the way to deep existential theological prophecies. It's a really wide spectrum. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Modern views on sin. 2. Sins of the institution. 3. The unpardonable sin. And 4. The mark of the beast. Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, Modern Views on Sin and the Sociological Realities of Belief. Let's anchor this with some hard data. Pew Research surveyed U.S. Catholics. And you know what? The concept of sin is absolutely alive and well. Nearly 9 in 10 Catholics firmly believe that some actions are genuinely offensive to God. But here is the real twist. They actually disagree quite strongly with their church leadership on what those actions actually are. It turns out moral authority has heavily migrated away from the institution and straight to the individual. Take artificial birth control, for instance. A staggering 66%, that is, 2/3 of U.S. Catholics, including 57% of the most devout weekly attendees, say that using it is just not a sin. The gap between the official Vatican doctrine and the everyday reality of American Catholics is pretty striking. And this trend of your personal conscience overriding institutional texts completely spills over into everyday lifestyle choices. Despite recent pushes by religious leadership to frame things like wealth hoarding as a modern sin, 73% say living in a house larger than you need is perfectly fine. Large majorities also see absolutely zero sin in divorce or cohabitation. For the modern believer, the boundary lines are highly individualized. Moving right along, Section 2, Sins of the Institution, when churches lose their way. But hey, it's not just individuals crossing these lines. According to consultant Bill Wilson from the Center for Healthy Churches, religious institutions themselves commit some pretty profound systemic errors. He identifies 8 grouped deadly sins of church organizations. Think of it kind of like corporate bloat, when a church becomes obsessed with its own survival, becoming completely money-centric, building-centric, or rigidly doctrine-centric. It literally loses its foundational mission. The contrast here is just night and day. And it's a great lesson in organizational health. On one side, you have a fragile ecosystem that is way too dependent on a physical structure or maybe idolizing a single pastor. On the other side, you have the healthy alternative, a mission-centric model that aligns congregational life outward, focusing on love and making disciples. It really shows us that institutional sin is ultimately just a massive failure of focus. All right, Section 3, the unpardonable sin, the ultimate existential boundary. Now we are zooming from institutional failure straight into deep personal dread with the unpardonable sin, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. According to pastoral counseling sources like CCEF, this terrifying concept stems from a very specific biblical moment where hard-hearted leaders intentionally attributed Jesus' power to Satan. But as the source points out, this is widely misunderstood today. It's not an accidental misstep or a slip of the tongue. It is deliberate, resolute defiance. So if you're someone plagued by passing intrusive thoughts or scrupulosity, counselor Ed Welch offers this incredibly profound psychological comfort. The very fact that someone is anxious about having committed this sin is actually proof that their conscience is still active. Therefore, they haven't committed it. It's a brilliant reframing that shifts the focus completely away from everyday anxiety and puts it right back on the nature of true intent. The Tomorrow's World Ministry actually echoes this. They point out that a completely seared conscience happens in one of 2 very specific ways. Either a deliberate, permanent choice of resentment or a slow, careless drift away from spiritual priorities. Whether it's active bitterness or just passive neglect, the boundary is crossed when a person permanently seals off their own willingness to ever seek forgiveness. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, the mark of the beast, prophetic and eschatological warnings. Let's dive into some deep eschatological theology here, using the Amazing Facts Study Guide, which interprets the ultimate sin through a highly specific prophetic lens. This theology synthesizes ancient prophecies from Daniel and Revelation to identify a composite religious political beast. And here is where it gets highly, highly specific. The study guide explicitly interprets this beast as the historical papacy, mapping the characteristics of ancient empires directly onto the imagery of Revelation. Their interpretation actually hinges on a very precise historical timeline. It charts a 1,260-year reign that suffered what they call a deadly wound in 1798, which is when Napoleon's general captured Pope Pius VI. According to this specific theological worldview, this historical wound is actively healing today, setting the stage for future world-altering events.
So what exactly is the ultimate boundary line in this specific doctrine? You might be surprised, but it isn't a barcode or a microchip. It's a day of worship, literally. It contrasts the biblical seventh-day Sabbath Saturday with the institutional adoption of Sunday worship. According to this perspective, indulging Sunday is an acceptance of institutional authority over biblical text. It presents the mark of the beast as a future, legislated choice of allegiance. From everyday sociological realities to massive institutional failures, all the way to deep prophetic warnings, the definition of sin remains one of humanity's most complex boundaries. We've seen how everyday people are increasingly relying on their own personal conscience, and how different theological frameworks interpret history to define ultimate spiritual lines. It leaves us with a pretty profound question. As our world continues to rapidly change, how will you define your own boundaries of right, wrong, and ultimate moral failure?